Okay.
Okay.
All right. Greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this very important conversation. I'm so excited to be in conversation with Dr. Sitara Akram. We are going to be talking about some recent experiences we've both had, as we have both put out on our channel videos talking about the hijab and taking a, well, controversial for our time position that hijab is not obligatory. Just by way of, I guess, visual, this was my recent video, why I don't wear hijab and why it's not a sin. And I think it was quite inflammatory for many people because they kind of saw the title and reacted to the title. And Dr. Sitara also put out her own, oops, let me see where to go, put out her own 5-part series now on the hijab, which is absolutely excellent. And I've watched it twice, and, you know, hopefully we can, and I keep referring people to it. And also I was really excited to see Dr. Sitara in conversation recently with Aram Saeed, also on the topic of hijab. So, you know, we have been out in the public taking this position. And I think what has been really fascinating is the reaction and the response in the comments to the YouTube videos, as well as for me, I have a Substack page where I write and I share, and I've had a lot of engagement on Substack as well. The audiences are quite different, but it's very interesting. I mean, I think the reactions have been similar, but in Substack, you have room for a lot of long form discussion back and forth, and people who are on Substack tend to be writers. And so, you know, they're articulate and educated, not to say people on YouTube are not, obviously, but just to say that, you know, there's a lot more space for people to really dig into comments. And so Dr. Sitara and I thought it would be a great time to just discuss the reactions and, you know, maybe the broader implications of that reaction. And so I have a whole laundry list of questions for Dr. Sitara. And but I wanted to first, of course, welcome you, Dr. Sitara, and give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and let people know about what you are up to and your background. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Grace. When you said when you're up to, it reminded me of, you know, in Harry Potter, when we're up to no good or something. There's a sentence in there, isn't it? Up to no good. So given the reaction we've had, we're up to no good.
Yes.
But just want to say assalamu alaikum to everyone. And thank you so much, Grace, for inviting me. It is an absolute privilege here to be speaking to you. You know how much of a fan I am of Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl's work. I have been reading his work for nearly 10 years now. And he's one of the key influences on my thought as well when I approach topics of jurisprudence, of which hijab is one as well. So thank you very much for having me. And in terms of introduction, this is the bit I always forget to do. I always forget to make notes about it. So I'm just going to just say what pops into my head. So I work in a university. My day job is as a leader and manager. So I'm very much into team leadership, service excellence, etc. But I work in a department where we support students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So it's a role which is very strongly value aligned for me, because I do care about wider society, and I've worked there a long time with a fantastic team. So that pays my bills very well and keeps me very happy. And then when my twins were about 10, I thought now is the time to start to go back to study. So I got my doctorate, and my area of research is Islamic finance, and that's what my PhD is. And what I've done, again, being up to no good, is critiqued the traditional definition of riba and usury, and I've given my own definition, which does challenge kind of the author's opinion on that. So I haven't yet had a chance to turn that thesis into monograph, but that's the intention at some point. I'm a migrant to the UK. I'm married. My sons are now both in university. So I've been a mum. I've done the whole mum thing. I've done the career thing, and I'm now doing the scholarship thing. So I've had, alhamdulillah, a very, very privileged life and a very well supported life in my family to be able to do all of this.
Alhamdulillah. That's, you know, it's so beautiful. I mean, knowledge is dangerous, right? So now we can stir up all kind of trouble, which we have, obviously. One of the things that I think is so lovely in this conversation is exactly that. You and I come from very different backgrounds. You were, born and raised as a Muslim, and I've been a convert for 31 years. And yet we, have both really, I think our life journeys have made us appreciate the value of knowledge and how empowering that is. And, for us to come together with a very, common view on this, I think I wanted to ask you about intentions because, as I mentioned to you before we started our recording, it's to come out in a very public way and make a controversial statement like, it's not a sin to cover. I think that you have to be either a masochist or a narcissist, or someone who's really committed to knowledge to put yourself in this position because you know what type of blowback is going to come at you. And, certainly, I had that experience, and I think you've had that experience. So I think it's important to talk about intention, and I think we come together on, the desire for female empowerment. But I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on that as you've navigated into this dangerous space?
It's a really good question, Grace. I think I want to start by saying that I, I can speak for myself that I did not set out to be controversial. And you don't deliberately court controversy. I think what happens is at some point you say something that becomes controversial or is received as controversial. Grace, I'm just getting a little bit of feedback from you. I think if you turn your mic on mute, then maybe I won't get the feedback because it's just echoing back at me.
Oh, okay.
Let's see if that makes a difference. Oh, yeah. So I think that's made it a bit better. So yeah, I certainly did not try to be controversial. That's not my intention. And it's really important that you've raised that point about intention as to, why do we do this work? And I don't want to say this, that I'm exceptional or just some kind of a wonderful human being, a super mom or something like that. But I have, I come from Pakistan. I moved to a new country where I had to start my career from scratch with toddlers with me. My sons were only 3 at the time. And my husband and I have worked really hard to establish ourselves in the UK and, focus on career and everything. So I've had very busy 20 years since I moved here. And with very busy full-time work, I'm in a senior leadership position. I have a lot of responsibility riding on my shoulders. And to do more work on top of that is not easy. So my doctorate, my research is honestly, it's work done on late evenings, it's work done on weekends. So it's almost like having a second full-time job. That doesn't pay me. So this is work that is purely driven from this quest for knowledge. It's no more than that. It's just quest for knowledge. And I wanted to understand Islam for myself, because as a Muslim woman, I felt really conflicted. I just could not reconcile with the idea that Allah thinks that He's created me inferior, that there's an issue, ontologically there's an issue, that gender is a problem. And I couldn't quite square that with the idea of God being a fair God and an unbiased God. I think those two things can't be reconciled. So I was faced with that contradiction. And so there's been this personal journey to understand Islam for myself. And then there's been the formal journey, which is my doctorate, where I'm working with a supervisor who's absolutely brilliant in matters of Islamic law. I was really lucky to have that mentorship. And that opened up an entire new world for me. So I myself went from holding a dogmatic position about hijab to actually holding an informed position about hijab. That's been my journey. So when I'm sharing that journey with me, I'm not trying deliberately to be controversial. I'm saying this is my learning, and others have the right to disagree with that learning. And unlike a lot of other scholars, I do not arrogate to myself the right of saying the absolute truth. I don't. All I can say is this is my informed opinion today. This is based on the evidence that I've come across so far, and I share that with people. So I think there are a few things here when it comes to intention. One is the claims that people sometimes make, which I do dismiss as arrogant claims, this idea that what we have is the truth and what we say is the absolute truth, and there are no two ways about it. So, when people are arguing with you or sending a lot of hate towards you and saying, but Grace, you've said that not wearing the hijab is not a sin. they're making those statements, which are very dogmatic statements. They're not always informed statements. I think sometimes they are, often they're not. But when it comes to intention, my intention in sharing this is not to dismiss the importance of the hijab, or to take away women's right to wear the hijab, but to make a comment, an informed comment on what I have understood about the hijab from my study of Islam's jurisprudential tradition, its interpretive tradition, what I've understood from the Quran, from the Hadith, from the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I'm sharing that. So that is my intention, is to share the knowledge, which is very limited, and to share that with people from a place of humbleness, and always remain ready to be corrected as well. So if other evidence comes to light, then I leave open the possibility that I would have to change my mind, because at the end of the day, I'm accountable to Allah. And I do believe, Grace, that people like you and me have more accountability because we have chosen to go public. If I was reading the Quran just for myself, and if I was trying to understand the hijab just for myself, that would be a different matter. I'd be sat here in my study, it would be my view. But once I go out and share that view with 10, 15, 20, or 5,000 people, then the level of accountability that I have in front of Allah is even higher. And so I then have to do more due diligence and more hard work and stand ready to be held accountable. So that's how I approach these things. That's my intention. And I would love to know from you as well, from your perspective as well, as a convert of making that really informed choice to embrace Islam, what has been your intention in sharing that with your viewers?
Thank you so much. I have many reactions to what you've said. I think that, I've been a convert for 31 years, and, I was a seeker of truth from, I think from the time I was a child. And it's taken that long for me to realize that, okay, God has curated for me my life in a very particular way. And I think that I was given the blessing of a very rare vantage point. I came to Islam, because I was seeking something clean, something beautiful. I had experienced darkness in my upbringing, in my childhood, in my, teen and college years. And I felt like, it wasn't until I arrived at business school where I was surrounded by a bunch of people who appeared to me to have things together, but were on a path of materialism. And it struck me at that time that there has to be more to life than this. I mean, I felt that, but at that point, that was when I had my crisis of life meaning and engaged in my faith journey. And so it took me 2.5 years to arrive at becoming Muslim from my initial intrigue. And it took a lot of learning and a lot of prayer, a lot of reflection. I became Muslim without ever having stepped foot in the mosque. And then immediately was told I need to wear hijab. Then the hijab issue came up. And then within a year of that, then, I had a lot of questions because I was new and I didn't know very much. And I had never really encountered the Muslim community and didn't understand the dynamics. And it was very, very different than what I found in books as I was in my faith journey. And then God arranged that I would meet Dr. Abou El Fadl. And, and so I had the opportunity. One of my first questions was about hijab. And so, I learned very early on that there was a lot of nuance in opinion, and imagine you come to the faith, absolutely nothing about anything. You don't know about Islamic law. You don't know about the, community. You don't know just really even the ethic or the culture, or that there is a difference in culture between, let's say, the Islamic culture from an ethical perspective versus ethnic culture, right? And how those things become conflated and confused. And especially for someone like me, I couldn't distinguish. I mean, I knew there was something off. It's like, okay, there's sort of an Arab way of doing this. When you go to the mosque, you go to an Arab mosque, you go to a, Turkish mosque or whatever. There's that ethnic element. But I was so blessed to have someone who's dedicated his entire life to studying this tradition, to be able to answer that question for me from an early stage. But fast forward 31 years, and you learn so I've been sort of scholar adjacent, right? I'm not an academic, but I consider myself an educated layperson. But I've learned about the ethic of knowledge, which is exactly as you say, that if you're going to speak and you are trying to convey something about God or God's book, you have to be really careful what you say, because if someone takes action based on them believing what you say, well, if they do something wrong, that's your accountability. And I think if people knew that, they would be scared into silence, because, I don't want that accountability. And so I learned early on that, yeah, like there's an etiquette to knowledge, and the more that you know, the more accountable you are. And so for me as a non-academic, the way you get around that is to say, this is my opinion and God knows best, so let me share with you my journey. And my journey has been so blessed because I have seen and experienced and learned so much. I mean, I have been very actively involved in Dr. Abou Fadl's scholarship from the time we met, over 30 years ago. So when we met, he had just finished writing the very first chapter of The Search for Beauty. And so everything that came after that, I edited, I was involved in, I got to discuss with him. And so I feel like this has been an incredible journey of learning. But the more you know, also, the more marginalized and alone you feel, and distant from the rest of the community, especially in this time, because people don't value knowledge, they don't read, they don't believe that there is that's important. Like I've told how many times, oh, Islam is black and white. It's an easy religion, sister. Why do you question so much? Why do you make it so complicated? And so that's part of my journey. And so my intention in this is, okay, God gave me and curated for me a particular life that came with a very rare vantage point. I knew from an early stage that hijab is not obligatory. And that was for me incredibly liberating and freeing. And we should talk. I know you used to wear hijab for a good amount of time. And I shared my story about how, I wore the hijab in my work setting for a certain time. And that's a window into an experience that is very important and very meaningful to talk about when you think about what is it that God wants from us. So my intention is to try in this very difficult time to help empower other women who are suffering under the shame or the misbelief that when they are not wearing hijab, that they are committing a sin, because that silences women, that makes them feel lesser and makes them feel like they're I mean, it's like, I think what you've said in your discussions with Adam Said, you feel that weight of being lesser, just like a fitna, right? Like something's wrong with you. You can't do anything right. And I'd like to remove that shame for as many women as possible. So that's really my intention. But share with me like your journey with hijab, and kind of how you arrived now at, because I'm struck by, like when you talk in your videos and you walk us through, your research, it's so accessible, so insightful. It seems so easy. I know you mentioned it took you 5 or 6 years to, put it all together. And I guess, I mean, when you feel you've reached that point where you can speak about it with some level of confidence, at least for your own journey, that it's so important. And when I watch your videos, I'm like, okay, there's no excuse. It's so easy just to watch these videos and educate yourself. So, why are we not doing that?
Yeah. Anyway. Thanks, Grace. And it was lovely hearing from you as well about your journey. And I think a lot of converts, when you were speaking, I was thinking about that because on Facebook, I have a number of friends who are converts, and they all speak about the pressure of doing the hijab. There's this conformism. I see it as conformism that's demanded. And rather than talking to new converts about kind of that ethical, moral framework of Islam, which is so powerful and so inspiring, that's and talking about those bigger questions around, meaning and purpose in life. Why are we here on this planet? What for? Conversations actually become very trivialized, very instrumentalized around clothing and how you should set foot in the mosque, and whether you're wearing lipstick or not. I know you've been criticized about that. So it's like you immediately enter a space of policing. And I know a few women who have then unfortunately also left Islam because of that pressure, because you're already trying to make so many changes. You might be getting a lot of pressure from your immediate family who are reacting to this. You might be experiencing Islamophobia. All of that's happening. And there's all of that inner turmoil. And then you have all of this policing happening outside. So I can't quite imagine how you would navigate that space. I think you would need a lot of that inner resilience and courage, and perhaps then constantly reconnecting with God. It's not an easy space to be in. So that's, I suppose, the extent of my empathy there, because I don't have the experience of a convert. But what I do have, and perhaps there are parallels there, is the experience of stepping away from my own tradition and critiquing it. And I can tell you, Grace, that needs a lot of courage because of the amount of unlearning that has to happen. And I think it is that unlearning that took a period of time. I was very lucky that I grew up in a household where we were surrounded with books and knowledge. The knowledge seeking was just part and parcel of who we were. You know, we had very modest means as a family, but my father would never say no to buying a book. That was his rule. And I have the same rule with my children as well. Say children, you know, grown men now. I have to correct myself when I say that. And what we also had was a very grounded sense of religion, which is very ethics oriented. So I wasn't quite aware, for example, of sectarian tensions. We were never given a sectarian view of religion. I suppose you can just call that mainstream Islam, which is the Islam of being ethical, saying your prayer 5 times a day, doing your fasting, making sure that you give charity to people who are deserving of charity or who need charity. And your general conduct needs to be ethical. That's kind of what we were. And to dress modestly, that's what we were taught. So I never had a sectarian outlook on any of that. But after I got married, about a couple of years into our marriage, both my husband and I were very influenced by somebody he knew who had, when I say joined a group, which was now, when I look back, was very much a Salafi group of Muslims. And Salafism was on the rise. I'm talking about the year 2005. So this is exactly about 20 years ago. Salafism had become really dominant in Pakistan. And of course, Wahhabism and Salafism, although they are slightly distinct from each other, they have a lot of commonalities. One of the things that they have, which is so attractive to somebody who is trying to find themselves and find Islam, is the thing you mentioned, those black and white certainties. And this is a hallmark of fundamentalism, by the way. And when I use the word fundamentalism, I do not use it in the sense of Islamist political views. I mean it in the sense of methodology. So fundamentalism, black, white, as you said, but sister, Islam is so simple. Our deen is so easy, so simple. Why are you overcomplicating it? And the certainties then are phenomenal because they're so attractive. They're like a psychological hook. And suddenly you spend a bit of time talking to such people and you read their literature and you say, I have found my deen. I have found hidayah. I have found guidance. This is what you tell yourself. So that process started. And when I then moved to Britain, then I became, from a religious majority Muslim country, I came to another country where I was a religious minority. By that point, I was already thinking about the hijab because the group of people that I was with were very strict about hijab. And as you would imagine, they would say things like a woman should be covered from head to toe, ideally should wear a niqab, but we're okay with a woman wearing a hijab. She doesn't want to cover her face. So these thoughts were in my head. But I'm very honest in saying that where I stood was dogma and where I stood was fundamentalism. It was a position that had emotional appeal to me. It was a position which gave me these certainties, and I felt quite good about that. When I came here as a minority Muslim, became a minority Muslim, then identity became important. Now, the British Muslim community is actually a very conservative community. And there's a very strong practice of wearing the hijab here. And I think a lot of it is to do with politics here. And whilst Britain is very multicultural, I've personally not experienced Islamophobia. I know people have. And so they feel very strongly about Muslim women looking distinct. We know there's politics to it, and we can come to that and unpack it a little bit. But I wanted to just feel confident in myself. I started taking the hijab. And at the start, I used to wear abayas as well, the long robes. And I used to wear them to work. As I said, I work in a university. Britain is very multicultural. Nobody bats an eyelid. It's you see so many women on campus who dress like that. It's not a problem. After, I would say, about 7, so I think I wore the hijab for about not just under 10 years. So it was a long period of time. I'm talking about when I was in my youth, from the age of 29 to about the age of 39. And I started, when I started to do my doctorate, what happened was that the processes of knowledge creation started to reveal themselves. And then I realized that what reaches us as truth is not always the truth. what it is an interpretation that somebody has given to you with a level of confidence saying, this is the truth. This is what the Quran says. But when you start engaging with the Quran through that lens of, okay, how do we interpret the Quran and make sense for ourselves and do it systematically? And this is where I think systematic knowledge is very important. I have great respect for scholars. But I also know that Muslims don't read the Quran. They just don't read the Quran, even at a personal level. Don't be a scholar, but read it for you. And I started to look through all the verses about women. I was starting to find confidence in myself as a woman believer, because we're taught throughout that we're inferior, we're intellectually deficient, we can't quite make sense of things because of how emotional we are. So, we have all of those stereotypes. But other people do interpretation for us, and other people tell us how to live our lives. And because I was always a very independent-minded person, and like you, I'm very fortunate that I'm married to a man who is not threatened with living with an independent-minded woman. So I had no pressure at home to conform to anything. These were all my choices. So I always had the freedom to take off the hijab, and I knew that my husband is not going to have an opinion because he knows that this is my accountability to God. He kept a beard for a long time, which I did not like, but I did not say to him, I did not say to him anything, because he has the choice. So he was finding his own path. He kept a beard for a good chunk of time, 8 to 10 years. So we were both influenced by that. And then what happened was, when I started to unpack the process of knowledge creation, I realized that interpretation is a human process. And when scholars interpret things, they make some assumptions. They are products of their own culture. They're influenced by the cultural space, the historical point in time in which the interpretation is done. And there are various views about these things. Also, I think maybe it was around 2017, I can't remember, I bought Professor Khaled's book, Speaking in God's Name. And that was a game changer for me, because it brought together all the classical sources, which have then been used to create modern authoritarian discourses on women. And it was such a game changer. And I remember going through that book and going through it again and again and again. And I still go through that book and cite it often. And so I then realized that there was no basis in the Quran, and there was no basis in the Sunnah. When I say Sunnah, I mean the normative praxis of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what he gives us as deen, the Islamic way of life. There was no normative statement in the Quran, and there was no normative practice from the Prophet himself that said that women should dress like this. The other thing I found was that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam never policed women's clothing. There isn't a single authentic hadith from him where he polices women's clothing. We might find a couple of hadiths where he makes comments on women if they're wearing a see-through piece of cloth or something. But even those hadith reports do not have a sound chain of narration. So there was nothing normative and reliable from him. In fact, what we find from the sound hadith reports is that he was always very accommodating. So you find reports where women say, I don't have a jilbab. So he says, share it with somebody, that outer cloak. He says, if you don't have one, because people did not have extra piece of clothing. So he said, if you don't have a jilbab, share one with another woman when you come to the mosque. So he was always accommodating, always flexible, always magnanimous in approaching this, rather than policing women and judging them. So it took me, Grace, about 2.5 years, I would say 3 years of reading various scholars, various viewpoints, to then arrive at the conclusion that the hijab was not mandatory. And so my journey then starts from taking a dogmatic, fundamentalist position to eventually arriving at an informed position. And it's that informed position that I then share with people. So that's been my journey. And I don't consider this a sin. And I don't consider myself sinful. And I only made the decision then to take the hijab off when you know how important it is for us to have that kind of inner sense of tranquility. Because we sat there thinking, am I just making it up because I find it hard? Or am I doing this because I genuinely care about what Allah says? Have I truly understood what he says to my capacity? And when I reached the point where I thought, no, I've done my due diligence, I feel satisfied with this, that's when I decided to take the hijab off. So it took me a long period of time. And even taking the hijab off, because it's such a major change, to your appearance and how you dress, how you conduct yourself. It's not, people think it's a piece of cloth. It's not. It changes your entire personality and how you interact with people. And one of the things, and this is where the fragility of ego comes in, right? because I was doing community education for about 4 years. So I was talking to Muslim families and I was sharing Islamic knowledge with them. I used to wear the hijab. And so one of the first things that was this way my ego came in and said, will people take you more credibly if you keep the hijab on? So you see, that's where it becomes instrumentalized. That I know that I'll be given more religious credibility if I keep the hijab on, but that does not make me authentic to who I am or who I am now. And so I took it off. And yes, I have taken the risk. And yes, I get a lot of reaction because there are, I think we have some barriers, Grace. So I'm not trying to be unkind here, but I'll explain the barrier. So the barrier for you is that you're a woman. So in traditional thought already, that's an issue. We have inferior intellect. We both share that. We're both women. We have inferior intellect. We're both non-hijabis, right? And you're a convert. So you've got 4 barriers. I've got 3. Now, the only one which is surmountable is the hijab. The others are not surmountable. Because in traditional thought, if I'm inferior because I'm a woman, I can't change that because that's just who I am. And you've decided to convert, you're a convert. We can't change any of that. The thing that we can change is the hijab. And that's the point I was making in my video, which I recorded when I got that reaction to my talk with Iram Saeed. I was trying to make the case that because Muslim women have been beaten down for so long, for so many centuries, and as I said, the other barriers are insurmountable. So the one thing that gives us validity and religious credibility as believers is when we wear the hijab. That is why it is so powerful for women. But then we know that it becomes, patriarchy co-opts it. And the moment patriarchy co-opts it, it becomes a mechanism of control. But that is the one thing that's surmountable. So I could start wearing the hijab today and my videos will be received completely differently. Just as for your video, if it was Professor Khaled who had said what you had said, he would be received differently. Because we are dealing with all of these barriers that we're trying to overcome, being Muslim women and trying to assert our right and our intellectual capability to understand the Quran and Hadith and Sunnah for ourselves, to understand fiqh for ourselves. And then we're saying we're not going to conform and wear the hijab. So we have all of these battles on very, very many fronts there. It's a long answer, but here's my journey.
Thank you so much. Extremely valuable. And, I really got that impression. That hit me hard when you were talking to Adam Saeed about the experience, I think, as Pakistani women, which I feel is unique. I mean, I haven't had that same exposure to the constant message that women are deficient of intellect, deficient, of whatever, you're you can't get anything right. And, so I have 4 strikes against me and you have 3 strikes against you. But this is then where it takes me to the thing that is surmountable or makes everything surmountable is then your relationship with God and truth, right? It takes you out of the fold, maybe from the community, but then you're in this very beautiful pocket of beauty with God, because it's not about the answer, whether the hijab answer is right or wrong. It's about where do you feel your connection and your commitment to truth and seeking truth and feeling that God validates you and your humanness, your personhood. And that's where I feel like, this is really the core of the journey, right? You've learned all of these things that are trappings of being a human being. Hopefully along that way, you've invested in developing your relationship with God such that you don't really need to have that validation anymore from your community. But it makes you more alone, of course. But it's like, I really believe in that, in that quote, one person with God is the majority and can do anything, and that's like ultimately powerful and liberating. And when you are on your journey trying to figure out, what is my purpose? Why am I here? What's the meaning of all of this? And why, God, did you create me the way you created me? And with all of my unique, things, it was strengths, weaknesses, outlooks, passions. And then you curate this life journey for me. So you've allowed me to see certain things, experience certain things, and now here we are able to give back, knowing full well we're going to get a ton of blowback, but that's okay, because our intention is that we're here to serve. Have I lost you? Oh no.
Hang on, I lost you just for a few seconds, Grace. I
Okay.
think you were saying that our intention is to serve God.
Yeah, so my point being that you have to go through a lot of certain life experiences to arrive at, and hopefully you can arrive there, because not many, I think many people don't arrive there. But if you are investing in that relationship and trying to find your footing and understand why you are here and what your service to God is, um, like that, like when I hear you talk about your journey and and your engagement with knowledge, I share that, and it's allowed us to be very, I think, empowered and reassured that even if the rest of the community is upset at what we're saying, we feel a connection to God. We understand in our heart that this is our truth. This is our truth with God, not just our truth, like we pulled out whatever felt most comfortable for us, which is what I think both of us have been accused of. But no, this is a journey that I took with God, and this is where God brought me.
Mm-hmm.
So and I wish that like that more people, when I hear how you were raised with knowledge, with a very balanced, grounded view of the main important things, like ethics, knowledge, books, searching, modesty, like these are really the big factors. This is what makes us Muslim, right? This is what actually should be grounding us. It's the broader themes, not the minor details. And I guess it, on the one hand, I'm so grateful, and then on the other hand, I'm so sad, right? Because what we are sharing comes from life experience and learning, and it's so easy for people to be so arrogant in their ignorance and come in and shut you down and make all kinds of assumptions about you, like, okay, I've been a convert for so long, but I will never be seen as just a plain Muslim. Like I had a conversation with someone about this. It's like someone mentioned to me, yeah, I see a 7-year-old who is born Muslim, and I've been a convert for decades. When will I get to be just a Muslim, rather than a convert? And it's an interesting, I mean, I feel like I have to say I'm a convert, one, because well, one, I'm proud of it. I'm proud to own it, and I understand what that means. But it definitely makes me immediately seen as someone who knows very little. And another convert friend of mine said, you're this source of entertainment and validation for born Muslims, right? People feel like, oh, see, we're part of this great religion. Look, we still have converts and whatever, and they're very smart and wonderful. But the minute that converts start using their brain and start, questioning and saying things that are outside of the accepted norms, they're immediately shut down and ostracized. And in light of the fact that this is a religion that started with all converts, it's a bitter irony, and it's a sad, but that there's opportunity too, right? This is why we're here. This is why we do what we do.
Yeah. Yeah. If I can just come in on that, Grace, a couple of things really. This what you're referring to, kind of this the court of human opinion. Now, where does validation come from? For many people, validation comes from the court of human opinion. So hijab is a visible marker. It's a visible marker of piety. Now, I personally think that there's a theological problem. There's a theological issue with having visible markers of piety. Okay? Because our piety is in our hearts, it's in our conduct, it's in our actions, it's in our decisions. Visible markers do not necessarily prove piety. We know plenty of examples of people who were seen as religious authorities, who were seen as pious, and they've committed heinous crimes. okay, amongst men and women. So what happens with visible markers is that they put you into the court of human opinion, but also converts, as you were relaying your experience, also find themselves in the court of human opinion. The question here is, who are these people who are judging? And why are they judging? What authority do they have to judge? And again, this goes hand in hand with the turn towards a very austere, puritanical, fundamentalist conception of Islam, which has emerged in the last 30 to 40 years. Okay, this is completely driven by petrodollars. And I would say the hijab culture is also petrodollars culture. And now that the petrodollars are changing to tourist dollars, suddenly the hijab is no longer mandatory in the country which published so much literature saying the hijab was mandatory. Okay, the same country, Saudi Arabia, is now allowing women to drive, is now allowing women to travel without mahram, the relatives, male relatives. You can now have a driving license. This was made a Sharia issue. Not being able to travel was turned into a Sharia issue. How you dressed was turned into a Sharia issue. My question is, has the Sharia changed? Sharia doesn't change, it's divine law. Divine law doesn't change. So what has changed? What has changed is that petrodollars are no longer funding that body of literature, the scholars, the websites, and the tourist dollars can no longer reconcile with a conservative form of Islam, because tourist dollars need to be dollars which are open to people visiting the country who will dress differently, who will behave differently. The point I'm trying to make is that this is major political change in the Muslim world in the last 30 to 40 years. When I was growing up, nobody ever judged other Muslims. We were taught not to judge. In fact, we were taught in our households that we should not make comments on other people's faith and other people's iman because God does not like it. It is not in our remit. And then through the Salafi stroke Wahhabi ideology, every Muslim has been turned into this little God. People play God all the time. So they'll come to you and say, Grace, you're now outside the fold of Islam. How many people said that to you? Hundreds of people have already excommunicated you from Islam. We have to remember that when people rebelled against the hegemony of the church, this is what was happening. Because in the institution of the church, the priests would say, as a representative of God, I'm authorized to say to you, this is how you must punish yourself. This is how you repent. So they spoke as representatives of God. We do not have a church in Islam. What we have is a much more egalitarian and democratic structure because there is no central authority here. So we are picking up a remit for ourselves that we have never been allowed to pick up. It is not for me to judge anyone. It is for God to judge us all on the day of judgment. But what this has done is these black and white certainties and this level of conformism has now given everybody the authority. People just start lashing at the people. It's like they have, metaphorically speaking, a whip in their hand and they start whipping and lashing out at other people. Beat them with a stick. Why? On what authority do you do that? So you are going to be judged because you're a convert. I might be judged because I'm not a convert. You're going to be judged on your appearance. I might be judged on my appearance. But what is really interesting, as this level of arrogance has increased amongst, ordinary Muslims, this level of arrogance has increased. And I understand this process because I've been a part of it myself. I know that for many years I was an arrogant Muslim, because the people I hung out with and the literature I was reading was telling me that I have these certainties, and I have the certainties not just for myself, but also for other people. I am certain that this other person is engaging in shirk or whatever, or I'm certain that this other person is engaging in, I don't know, some kind of sin. And you judge them, you throw them out of the fold of Islam. Whereas if you look at our scholarly tradition, takfir or excommunication was always strongly forbidden by all of our scholars, because they always said, you can't do this. This is not your remit. You're not allowed. Only God can do that. And yet, so casually, we throw people out of the fold of Islam. Why? Because they don't conform to something we have decided is Islam. When we were growing up, we were taught not to do that. Similarly, and thankfully I'm old enough to remember these things, nobody ever taught us that the hijab was obligatory. That was not part of religious teaching. And we know that religious teaching and the Islamic way of life is generational transfer of knowledge. So where children are born in a Muslim household, you basically start with them young and you give them information about how to say the prayer and what verses to recite and what du'as to recite and all of that. And you also teach them about modesty, how to dress, or where all the moral red lines are. This is all part of your upbringing. Why is it, and I've raised this in my recent video as well, why is it that this one obligation of the hijab was forgotten by our mums? You know, they taught us everything. They even taught us how to wash ourselves, how to trim our nails, how to eat, you know, how to sit, how to drink water, everything we were taught. And yet we were not taught this, but we were taught modesty. So I think what you're experiencing, what the experiences you've had, Grace, I think your conversion to Islam 30 years ago has actually aligned very much with the rise of Salafism in the Islamic world. And for people who are younger, so when I talk to 30 somethings or people who are in their 20s, this is the only Islam they've known. So I really feel for them. I feel for them because actually they've known a very fundamentalist and ugly and hateful and divisive version of Islam. That is not the version of Islam I grew up with. My version of Islam was very reconciliatory. My father's best friend, who's, you know, his friend has now passed away. My father's best friend was a Shia Muslim. The Sunnis and Shias lived in Pakistan amicably. There was no animosity between them. And when they were young, they used to pray in each other's mosques. They would finish college, and whichever mosque was nearby, they would just head to that mosque and they would pray. And when my father would pray in the Shia mosque, he would respect the Shia form of prayer. Nobody ever made any fatwas, and nobody excommunicated them from Islam. Now you have mosques saying Shia mosque, Sunni mosque, and people will not enter those mosques if they're from the other sect. So we have seen in the 30 years, there's a particular form of Islam which has become dominant. And unfortunately, it's really damaged the grounded, kind of mainstream lived reality of Islam, which was very relaxed, very secure in itself. And it was not belligerent, it was not confrontational. We did not have to go out to everyone and make the point, look how pious I am. You did not do that. It was not considered acceptable behavior. So I think we've seen that kind of your journey has almost run in parallel with these historical and political forces at play. That's my sense in here.
No, absolutely. And, you know, this is where it's hard. You have to get into a discussion of politics and Islamophobia, the rise of Wahhabism, the fact that there is an Islamophobia industry and how much money is poured into creating like the sectarian divides, people's understandings. You know, like in America, the Saudis were very instrumental through their financing of mosques here to be able to control the type of Islam that was okay and not okay. So we were definitely on the receiving end of that. Dr. Abou El Fadl was not allowed. He was on a blacklist and not allowed to speak in, you know, certain spaces. You know, we went through, you know, our own issues with like, you know, death threats and all kinds of things because he was very vocal, especially after 9/11, about the rise of Wahhabism. And in fact, he wrote a piece several days before the 9/11 attacks, which were published in the Los Angeles Times, about his worry that something like 9/11 would happen. And sure enough, within a few days, it did happen, which was shocking. And then a few days after that, he wrote another piece. But I think at that time, people were too scared to criticize Saudi Arabia because they had so much money and influence. And, you know, certainly with Dr. Abou El Fadl, they tried to first, you know, buy him. Like they offered him a lot of money and awards to be able to have sort of the last editing rights to his publications. And of course, that didn't work. And then tried to silence him and then tried to kill him, you know, and then things moved in such a way that now we're sort of, you know, we're so small now compared to the, you know, the how much money, how much power the Saudis, the UAE, all these people have. But it was a part of the design to you know, control the narratives, control the thinking, you know, to tell people that Islam is very black and white. You know, when I converted and I went to the masjid for the first time, then one of the most popular books was called Halal and Haram. And it was literally just a list of products that you could buy, halal, haram, no methodology, no anything, just here. See, it's so easy. Don't buy this. Yes, buy that. And, you know, this is, if you explore that from a knowledge perspective, everything falls into place. You understand and you see the dynamic, but the problem is the vast majority of Muslims are not paying attention. They don't value, you know, like the knowledge, the role of knowledge in helping to open your eyes to this dynamic. certainly colonialism and the control, and all of this supports, an endless wartime economy here in the U.S., right? So how much, of course, we have to spend billions and trillions of dollars for more weapons and more bombs, and who gets bombed? Well, Muslim countries, of course, Gaza and everybody. So it all makes sense. And, this is part of the work we do at the Suli Institutes. Like every week, we are unpacking more and more of this. But it's not for everyone, right? Because most people hear these types of things, and we are deep in the knowledge, but if you're not following it, you're not tracking with it, you're going to feel like these guys, they're complicating things too much. But I think what is horrifying is if you see the decline of our ummah and our civilization and our, even just in the reaction to our hijab videos. This is what I wanted to really talk about, is what it reveals about who we are as a people, and how far we've come, from being at the height of civilization, um, to now there is no semblance of an ummah. We are fully divided, whether it's sectarianism, whether it's a woman wearing hijab, whether it's, every little bit. And I think it's also, symptomatic of just the Muslim experience at large, right? We are an oppressed people. We are, bombed and killed everywhere. We have no voice when it comes to any issue related to the world. We're supposed to be at the forefront of everything good in humanity. We should be at the forefront of, discourses on human rights, on sciences. I mean, everything. Like, as a definition of being a Muslim, you're supposed to be the best of the best. And yet we're not. We don't have any presence on any human rights organizations. We don't have any power. You have 2 billion Muslims in the world, and they cannot stop a genocide. So, why? And so, we have to go back and look at what is the problem. And a huge piece is knowledge. We have completely lost sight of our tradition, and are completely unaware of the forces that are trying to destroy it, and are doing a very, very good job. People are asleep at the wheel. They have no idea. And so, the good thing, I guess I would say, I know Dr. Abou El Fadl gave a very powerful khutbah several months ago about how because we are at sort of the bottom of civilization, what it does present for us as a people is an opportunity to bear witness in a way that we never have before. So, when you are at the height of civilization, things get muddied because of the power dynamic. But because now we occupy the oppressed in the world, that position, well, now we have a much clearer vantage point of what it's going to take, and what is necessary and needed. But it requires, again, education and knowledge. So when I get into these back and forth debates with people on my, comment sections, it reveals so much, right? I mean, the first pass being, oh, look at her, she's not wearing hijab, how can that even be? Stupid little convert. Oh, how sweet. On the one hand, it's kind of like, how dare she make such a bold statement? Who does she think she is? And, she's a convert of 31 years. What does that even mean? She obviously doesn't know anything. And well, give her time. That's why I'm like, well, it's been 30 years. How much time should I have to figure out I have to wear a hijab? But then the comments are so patronizing too, from people who are decades younger than me, and trying to tell me the most kindergarten level basic things, which are just generalized, like, sound bites that they've heard, that they're just repeating from the mosque. And so when I push back and I challenge, and I've been told everything from I'm using complicated jargon to try and pretend to be knowledgeable, to oh, sister, getting like a whole lecture on Islamic jurisprudence, where, alhamdulillah, like, I understand exactly what this person is trying to say, and I recognize exactly why what they're saying is wrong, and I push back and I explain, and they won't let it go. They keep coming back, and I'm like, okay, at what point do I stop? Because I'm not a scholar, so I can't argue everything from, obviously from a juristic perspective, but I know enough to say, here's why you're wrong. But does that matter? And really, in a world where we're getting genocided, across the world, is this really our biggest priority, to be nitpicking about hijab? But it's an important issue for me because, like I said, okay, when things are so devastated for us as a people, where do we begin? We have to begin at empowering at the individual level. And we have effectively put into our communities something that silences 50% of our population, the women. And you and I both know women are amazing. They hold up everything. They do everything. In a household, they do everything. And, and I understand the weight of that shame, but I haven't had to bear it because I know it's not true. So for the women who do bear that shame of, oh, I can't wear hijab because it's just, it could be anything. It makes me depressed. It makes me not believe, it makes me feel like an outsider. It makes me, lose my job, my respectability, all of that stuff. Those things are real. And, and also to feel like, oh, is God going to punish me because I'm not wearing hijab? I mean, okay, this is something in, like, just watching your 5 videos is way more than enough to release that. But you cannot get people to watch even 2 minutes of your video. Like, it's like, I mean, honestly, like we at the Suli Institute, right? We spent 3 years going through every single surah. And from an ethical perspective, it is life transforming. It is game changing. I mean, you talk about how speaking God's name was a game changer for you. This was a game changer for understanding the Quran and how relevant it is to our day and age. When we would try to tell people we're doing this, eyes glaze over. Like, people don't believe the Quran has anything to say to them anymore. It's, oh, an archaic medieval book, it's sort of repetitive and yeah, it's beautiful, whatever. I mean, people don't understand, like, we, going through every single surah, we started at a baseline with English translation, flat translation, very like, here it is, here's what this verse means. And then we would delve down into a second layer of meaning, which would add more nuance. And then a third layer of meaning, which you would go, whoa, into a completely different world and existence. And, and then for Dr. Abou El Fadl, like, his original contribution is that every single surah is a coherent, unique moral message, right? And this is nothing that anyone has ever heard. And then he demonstrates that. And then, like, as a convert who does not speak Arabic, I was floored. I'm married to the man. I didn't know he was working on this, so I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And I started getting angry at English translations because they're so reductive and they're so singular. This is what this means. And then, okay, so my understanding, or my access to the Quran, for 25 years was just like, okay, maybe I have 5 different English translations and I can compare what one translation says versus another. This is a whole different thing. It's like you go into the context of what, you feel like what it was like to be alive at that time and what was happening, and, the relationship between the Prophet, peace be upon him, and God, and the conversation that was intended to be for the Prophet, but also for us as human beings, knowing that this is going to live on, this message is going to continue, for forever. And so does God not know that in 2025 we're going to have these things happen, and that that the words of the Quran are going to be more meaningful for us today than they were when they were revealed? And so what does it say when someone comes in and tells you can't change the Quran, you can't, we're held in hostage in time, like, we have to understand what God said to us 1400 years ago. We have to go back to brushing our teeth with miswak. It's like, okay, forget the oral hygiene, advancements. It's just like, oh, there's no role for aql, God forbid, reasoning, God forbid. The text is clear. The text is only as good as the person who's reading and interpreting. And you can't have an interpreter from 1,000 years ago be relevant for 2025. And so it's like, seems like it's so obvious, but it's like you're battling this wall of ignorance. And like, I was sharing with you that I have, someone on my Substack who's a student, and obviously knows a lot when it comes to terminology of, Islamic jurisprudence, and is very happy to throw at me all kinds of Arabic terms that I think are intended to silence me and intimidate me. And I, alhamdulillah, have the ability to know what he's saying and throw it back and introduce more. Lost your, okay. I just stopped because the internet went out a little bit. But it's like these, tools of silencing women. And even, the point of, when you have a little bit of knowledge, you're dangerous. Well, when you have a little bit of bad knowledge, you're also extremely dangerous, right? And for a convert, when men especially come in and try and silence me on the issue of hijab, well, first it's like, well, you're not a woman. It's not, like, step aside. It's not your issue. But, come in and try to argue, as you so, like, appropriately pointed out, women went from having a vagina to becoming a vagina. I'm sorry for being so explicit, but it was perfect because the definition of Awrah, what the private parts of a man and a woman, and how the interpretation of that word has changed over time, and how we receive the very conservative interpretation as God's given truth today. How do you break past all of that except for knowledge and education and empowering the individual and giving people, a reconnection with God's word that they don't even know is there or believe is there. 3 years with deep dives into the Quran talk about life transforming. The people who've gone through it understand. I never knew the Quran existed in that way. I never knew, like, I've read, but it's like, okay, I'm married to the man. I had no idea that engagement would be so enlightening and so freeing, so empowering, and so reassuring. So you come to all of the Muslims who are having crises of faith, and you try to tell them, go back to the Quran, watch this, understand this. This will change everything for you. And it's so difficult to convince Muslims to read their own book. Anyway, it's so frustrating.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And actually, when you were speaking, I was thinking Grace has read my mind. So, when I was out on a walk just before we got together to record this, and I remember making some notes. It's always, my brain functions better when I'm out in fresh air. And one of the things that occurred to me was in Urdu, there is a word knuckle. I mean, it exists in Arabic as well, I believe, which is to copy. And so the Ahlul Hadith in Pakistan will they're very transparent about it. You have to give them that. So they will say, when it comes to the Quran, the best explanation of the Quran is the Hadith. Now, obviously, this is a very problematic approach, but that's the first thing they'll say. The second thing they'll say is Hadith is also revelation. And when Hadith comes to you, you must stop reasoning. So you don't use akal, you don't use reason. It is a part of the methodology. You don't use reason, you use knuckle. So you copy what earlier people have done, and you take a literalist approach to hadith. So you try to copy what the hadith has said, but you don't use reason. Now, as I said, we've had an entire generation of Muslims grow up listening to that and believing that. So it's very hard to say to them and very hard to convince them that akal, our ability to reason, is a gift from God. And he has given that gift, and then he has reminded us, I think more than 30 times in the Quran, that you should do tafakkur, that you should use your ability to reason. Allah says that his message is for those who hold akal. And Allah says that we're meant to ponder on the Quran, tadabbur. So when we do that, the Quran keeps yielding meaning. How I read the Quran translation when I was 18 years old and how I read it now are completely different. I'm a different person. Circumstances have shaped me. Life experiences have shaped me. I've had some challenges to deal with in my life. I've had to go back to the Quran again and again as something to hold on to give me solace. When I read the Quran, when I'm in tears, it yields different meaning. When I read the Quran on a day I'm in a happy mood, it yields different meaning. So when people read the Quran, you always have to think about, who is reading it and with what intention. Because the same Quran is read by our scholars who are already wedded to patriarchy, and they go and find patriarchy in the Quran. And they will very comfortably say, but the Quran is patriarchal. God does want a patriarchal society. And you sit there and you think, my God, how have you read that? They've read that because there is a lens, the paradigm already exists. When I was teaching a a class of postgrad students. I was doing some research like teaching at University of Leeds when I was doing my doctorate, and it was an opportunity for me to share my research with them as well. And I used to use a metaphor to help explain this to them, that Muslims are wearing these pink tinted glasses, okay, because the glasses are tinted pink, everything around you appears to have a pink hue, and you think that this is what the world is, it's pink tinted. But if you take the glasses off, it looks different. And so we're wearing these rose tinted glasses. Now, those rose tinted glasses could be patriarchal glasses. So if your lens is already patriarchal, you're going to find patriarchy in the Quran. If your lens is emancipatory, like mine is. So, like you, Grace, as a child, even as a child, I remember just ranting and railing against injustices in my own way. When I was 10, growing up in a country where there is abject poverty and destitution, right? People in Pakistan are poor, and the poverty is heartrending. You can't, it's difficult to comprehend it and soak it in, the indignities and humiliations people live with every day. That's the country I grew up in. And I grew up in privilege, but I saw it and I couldn't disconnect from it. And I remember when I was 10 and I started writing this book, and it was called the Problems in Pakistan, it was titled. And it had like 10 or 11, I still remember it had 10 or 11 chapters, none of which I wrote. I wrote the headings only. And the headings were things like not having clean drinking water, not having access to money, poverty, women not able to have education. So illiteracy was one of the, child labor. So I remember I had a list of social issues, and this is me as a 10-year-old, just kind of having that sense of there is injustice around me. So when I read the Quran, I read it as an emancipatory text. That is my lens. But I'm aware of that lens. How many patriarchal scholars are aware of their lens? They're not. So they will say things like, of course, Islam is patriarchal. Of course, it wants a patriarchal nuclear family. Of course, the man has the right to tell his wife what to wear. And, they'll do that. They'll read that into the Quran. And so there is the intention, and there's also the lens. The reason why I'm going into this depth is the lens that has been shaped for us by Salafism, particularly, is a regressive lens. It is regressive because the argument it makes is look back to the past, and live the way people lived 12 or 1300 years ago. So it has put us psychologically in what I feel is a contortionist, kind of this contortionism. So here we are in the modern world. AI has now reached our lives. I've started to use AI. I'm feeling quite clever. AI is there. We've had 20, 25 years of internet. You and I are sat here across the Atlantic. We're having this conversation. The world has changed. Women are in work. Women are visible. Women are in public spaces. But you have this regressive ideology with its glasses, and those glasses can only look to the past. So they've had the entire Muslim ummah, if there is such a thing. I don't think there is such a thing, but let's say the Muslim community has now been convinced that put on that nostalgic pink lens, look back to the past. The answers have been given by scholars of the past. So we're regressive in our outlook. We want to march towards the past. The reason why this is contortionist, and there's a paradox here as well. The contortionism is Grace Song and Sitara Akram and everybody else on this planet must regress back into living in mud huts and traveling by camels and wearing black robes, which, by the way, are imagined. We don't know if women wore black robes, but this is what they must wear so they can fulfill the vision of Islam. The paradox there is that on one hand, you say that the Quran is timeless, but on the other hand, you say it could only be understood by people 1400 years ago, 1300 years ago. Here is the paradox. And this is why Salafism, in my view, when I've done all the analysis, the way I can encapsulate is that it has it has a paradoxical relationship with history. And Salafism is ahistorical. It is ahistorical. It puts us in a contortionist position. So now you have Muslim women wanting to think bigger, play bigger, take on positions of leadership. What are they told? Stay in your homes. Stay in your homes because 1300 years ago, 1400 years ago, women stayed in their homes. And because they stayed in their homes, they created the perfect society. Did they? Was that society perfect? There was slavery in that society. There was murder in that society. There was extreme cruelty and prostitution in that society. It isn't as if the slate had been bleached clean and suddenly all of Arabia turned into this heaven with no crime and no sin. Nothing of the sort ever happened, right? People transformed their lives and they transformed the whole world, absolutely. But they did that because they had knowledge and they were committed and they were open to scientific and technological progress. Now, because of this rose tintedness, the other thing they do is they say all knowledge is in the Quran and Hadith. So they're not open to other forms of knowledge. Whereas when I approach knowledge, I see all knowledge as coming from God. He's given us the ability to think. And for that reason, we can do history and historiography, we can do archaeology, we can do psychology, phenomenology, information technology, astrophysics, we can do all of that. This is knowledge given from God. Now, the Quran is a book of moral guidance. Once it's fixed our morality, it leaves it to us to design society and design how we want to live, right? The lines are where the morality is, where the universal values are. So, for example, the Quran would say, center the vulnerable. In its economic, I don't want to use the word economic because economics is a new science, but in the Quranic verses that deal with trade and commerce and economic behavior, right? What does the Quran say? Center the vulnerable. So I would say, when I translate it to 2025, I would say to scholars of Islamic finance, if they would listen to me, a non-hijabi woman, I would say, start your economic policy from centering the vulnerable. So how about we say, in Pakistan, we want to achieve an economic position where no child goes to bed hungry. Now, build from that, this is what the Quran would say: the traveler, the wayfarer, the poor amongst you, the widows, the orphans, give them charity. They shouldn't go to bed hungry. That's what the Quran is saying. That's your economic policy objective, right? Work from that, back up, and create your banking systems and economic institutions. We don't do that. What we do instead is we say riba, or usury, as defined by the Hanafi scholar Al-Jassas about 1,000 years ago. That is the definition that will explain to us what the forbidden riba is. And what do? We get stuck. We get stuck because we now have something unworkable. And because it's unworkable, Islamic finance is, as we know, a legal stratagem. It's not true to the spirit of the Quran at all. Okay, as Shakespeare says, that doesn't he in Romeo and Juliet? He says that which you call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So whether you call it a rose or you call it that flower that smells sweet and has thorns, it's still a rose. So the point I'm trying to make here is, I think we have had decades of a regressive ideology. And what that ideology says is no new knowledge is possible, no new reasoning is possible. Whereas what we need, if we're going to change all of this, is to get Muslims to stop being so political all the time and stop doing this politics of anger and belligerence and this kind of victimization that we have, this sense of victimization that we've created. Everybody's out to get us. Everybody's out to get us because we're weak. We're the ones who need to work harder and put our house in order. And that is the law in the Quran, that Allah says quite clearly that he helps those people who have faith and who do good deeds. So that's what we're supposed to do. But what has been done instead is all those failures of leadership that you've just cited, that I've just mentioned, economic failures, political failures, our inability to stop a genocide that's been unfolding on our screens now for nearly 2 years. We haven't been able to stop it. And so many of the failures, what do? We focus on policing women's clothes. And you know why we do that? Because it's easy, because women are already oppressed. Muslim women, mostly, not all of them, there are many emancipated women, but look at what's happening in Afghanistan, look at what's happening in Pakistan, look at how women are treated usually in conservative Muslim societies, right? Girls are still being sold into marriage in our countries, right? Women have acid thrown on their face because they have rejected a man's marriage proposal. These are the realities that we're dealing with, right? The Taliban have just made women voiceless. It's easy to oppress women because they're already oppressed, they're already weak, they're already downtrodden and broken down. And this is where my issue is with hijab. I absolutely respect Muslim women's right to wear the hijab. If they interpret the Quran like that and they feel that it takes them closer to God, it makes them feel more confident, safe. But I would also say at an inner level, that is it making you more compassionate? Is it making you more ethical? Please do that. But if you're going to use the hijab to beat up other Muslim women who are raising their voices against injustices and are trying to be public and occupy public spaces, which God has given them the right to, if you're using the hijab to judge other women, if it's leading you to becoming arrogant, if it's turning you into a little God, you're actually committing a major sin, because arrogance is not forgivable in Islam. Arrogance will not be forgiven because of the harm it causes to other people. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is there is the theological and the jurisprudential approach to hijab, where you and I are making our comment about whether it's a sin or mandatory or not. I consider the hijab, the mandatory hijab, to be a bidah in Islam. It is a new addition. So, when people are saying to you on your, in reaction to your video, Grace, that now you've said something new. No, I would pose the counter question and say, on what basis are you stressing that hijab is mandatory? Where is your basis from the Quran and the Sunnah to say that the hijab has been made mandatory and not wearing it is a sin? That is the question. And in fact, making hijab mandatory is new. That is the newness. That is the bidah in Islam, because it's been made mandatory when it was never considered mandatory. And our scholars were very careful in using the word wajib for it. They never used the word fard, right? And there are reasons for that, and we can explore them. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make in this long-winded answer is, because we have a regressive outlook, in that regressive outlook, our women must stay indoors, they must remain silent, they must remain invisible, because that is what we see is the idealized version of Islam. The idealized version of Islam is the 1,000-year-old version of Islam. And so we've put in this contortionist space where we just don't know how to be. Honestly, when you talk to Muslims, particularly Muslim women, and now young Muslim men as well, they are so conflicted. When I talk to my sons, the kind of things they're picking up on social media are so alarming. How our young Muslim men think. We're setting them up to fail and be miserable for the rest of their lives. And the reason why we're doing that is because we're regressive. We are saying to people, go back and live in a cave if you want to be a Muslim. And what we're saying, in effect, is that the Quran could only achieve its greatness 1200 years ago. It can no longer give us any inspiration. Whereas people like you and I see the Quran as an inspiration to create a new future. So the outlook is completely different, right? If the Muslim community is regressive, if they're facing that way, you and I are facing that way. And that is where the clash and the rub is. And we're not offering any certainties at all. And so we can be shut down very fast. And, agents of the West. I always say that I pay my taxes to King Charles.
This was a really valuable, comment. And I think that you have to go back to the foundational belief system that you hold. Because I consider myself a divine idealist, right? And even the word revert, I hate, because revert is exactly that. You have to go backwards, and for me, Islam, everything I know about Islam is forward moving. It's a vibrant message. By definition, it's like, okay, what kind of God do you believe in? I mean, it's absurd to think that, okay, all of us are supposed to go back in time. Well, so then how is the Quran even relevant for our day and age? And even the idea that, okay, how do you how do you make the Quran come to life? You take its moral principles and you apply them to the issues that we have today. What is the point of religion if it doesn't address what you confront today? And as if God himself is like restricted to that moment in time, which is just so close-minded. And so to me, it's like, okay, you have to go back and investigate which God are you believing in? Like, if this is the God that, if this like version of Islam was what I understood God to be, I would never in 100 years become Muslim. Why? This is a message for humanity. So it's not just for Muslims. So when I also approach the Quran and what the Quran says, I'm also thinking of non-Muslims, because it's like, okay, one, we are an ambassador to the faith. So we have to be, an excellent example and an excellent, role model for what is the best that humans can achieve. And if that means that all of our women have to be covered in black robes with one eye showing, really? Is that what we're going to inspire the rest of humanity with? And we are at the bottom of civilization. We're not contributing anything to civilization. So you have to look at the, is this any coincidence? So it's like, do you want to move forward? Like one, yeah. So this whole idea of reversion is
Yeah.
just flat out wrong.
It
And
is, yeah. And it dismisses your journey.
exactly,
That's what it does. It dismisses your previous journey, which actually led you to this destination.
exactly. And we want to be forward thinking. We want to be aspirational. Like, to me, the Quran is an aspirational text. It's like, here, yes, here are the moral foundations. This is what we bring because it's a beautiful, clean, intuitive message, resonates with other human beings, but okay, so here are the boundaries. But beyond that, elevate, raise humanity to the next level for your time. And so I also think, I liken it to the idea, I'm going to take it to a different topic. The idea when you're raising babies and people have two different approaches. When they're crying, let them cry it out because they need to figure out, whatever. Or the other side of it is pick them up immediately as they cry. And that's more the attachment side. And I fundamentally always believed in that, because what you're communicating to your baby is a measure of safety. If I'm calling for help, someone will be there for me. In the other version, if a baby is crying out, needs help, and no one's coming to their rescue, they're always trapped in a level of unsafety. And so there are, like, there's research that proves that for babies that feel that anytime they cry, they immediately get help, they learn a level of safety and their development improves. They're able to go to the next level because they feel that they have safety and they can then begin to explore the worlds. Muslims, I believe, are in this level of unsafety, right? They are decimated at every level. And sometimes this patriarchy, or this need to control women, is their way of maintaining that level of safety, but it prevents them from moving forward and thinking in a forward way. I think that that's the whole idea of the regressiveness, is we go back to something that felt comfortable and safe for us, but it actually is what prevents us from participating in society, participating in the world, actually impacting the world for the better. And so how can we also change that? Aside from asking yourself, what type of God do you believe in? What do you think religion should play? What role should religion play for you, if not to improve your life and liberate and empower you as a human being? Like, what is the point of, no, I lost my train of thought. Like, um, what
I
was I
think
saying?
you were no,
No.
you were saying about, Muslims
Okay. Oh, I came
kind of
through.
have, it's that attachment that Muslims have to the past because it makes them feel safe. But actually that's what's preventing them. And their control of women is their way of feeling safe and harking back to the past when women used to stay in the house and, be
Right.
invisible.
Thank you. Sorry, I was like, my brain was going in 5 different directions. So, but my point is, how do we as a community come back to a point of safety, in a sense, where we can then get beyond this reversive, like this regressive thinking, right? Like, you have to feel you have a foothold somewhere so that you can start to dream and start to think about letting go of the control, to so that, I mean, this is sort of like a typical trauma response, right? It's like, when you are traumatized, you try to overcompensate by over controlling, and there's no space for creative thinking, for letting go, being free to explore. So what does that mean? I mean, I think, again, to my point about wanting to help empower the individual, we kind of have to go back to the foundations, back to the basics. Think about, what's the point of your faith, um, and do also some of this work, because we all Muslims, I think, have had significant trauma, just by definition of the way the world is, and the way that you have to work through it. There's no getting around it. You have to be honest. You have to be clear on whatever it is that's holding you back. If you've been through, a certain level of trauma, if you're feeling societal shame, that like, we as a community of believers are only as good as our individual parts. And if we can strengthen ourselves at that individual, at that granular level, when we come together, we're stronger, and we are even more than the sum of our parts. But as long as we remain in this very broken, traumatized, regressive, state, we will never move on. And where does that come from? Where does that power come from? From knowledge, reconnecting with the Quran, reconnecting, and not just, black and white versions of Quran, but the ones that are truly liberating. And here they are, like the work that Dr. Abou El Fadl did with the tafsir, and now the sirah, and your work with, the hijab. I mean, all of this stuff is, and why is knowledge the greatest jihad, right? And even the idea of wisdom is where you find it. So it's not just in the Muslim space, it's wherever you find it. So that's already a call to go find wisdom wherever you can find it. And who are we if we are not part of the human civilization? It's not just that we're a collective of Muslims. I mean, we're supposed to be a collective of humans that work together. What's the point of diversity, right? And I've had so many experiences with non-Muslims that are so beautiful. And how can you deny that beauty, even if they're not Muslim? So what? The Quran, and this is another thing. I did this other video of why I fell in love with Islam, and I made this point about how, okay, it's God's business who makes it to heaven, not ours. And it states very clearly in Surah Baqarah, verse 62, there will be Muslims, Jews, Christians, Sabians, others in heaven. Okay, so already it's like we are in a competition over piety and the creation of goodness, not over labels. So even that idea, like, I get a lot of these, stupid comments about, oh, only Muslims are, okay, only Muslims are going to make it to heaven. Okay, that's Christianizing Islam, right? And so, or like saying, oh, if you're not chosen, if you're chosen, not the chosen person by birth, then you're not going to make it to heaven. Well, we learned in our tafsir, Surah Baqarah, a complete denunciation of this idea of chosen people from an ethnic perspective. Anyone can be chosen based on their actions, based on their deeds, and so again, so liberating, right? I mean, you remove the shame of, okay, oh, I wasn't born Jewish, oh, I didn't accept Jesus Christ. No, you individually have the power to make your beautiful relationship with God, make you a rock star in the heavens. And that is something that I hope that the work that we do and the education that we do can give to anyone, well, men and women, but women in particular, to feel empowered and free, that's you can find that path. It's open to you. Everything in the world is open to you to achieve your full potential that God gave you. But you have to do the work. You have to invest in the knowledge if you want to be free. So anyway, yeah, I just wanted to share.
No, and I agree with you completely, Grace. And that's one of the reasons why when I started my YouTube channel, what I wanted to do was what had been very empowering for me, as I said, was understanding the process of knowledge creation. I think, and I could use a big word for it and say epistemology, understand the epistemology of Islam and understand the hermeneutic. And yes, but in a nutshell, how do we arrive at religious rulings? How do we arrive at understandings of various verses of the Quran? Once you understand the how, it is hugely liberating. And I wanted to do that particularly for not just for Muslim women, but also for Muslim men who want to work in allyship with Muslim women, because Allah expects Muslim men and women to be allies of each other. What I personally find very inspiring in the Quran. I mean, I probably going to sound like an ideologue, but I do genuinely feel that the Quran has the answers for all of the crises that we see around us. I genuinely believe that. I mean, what's happening now in America, and what we're seeing, the collapse of institutions, and also in a way, in Britain, politics is very fractious at the moment. There's in Europe as well, there's a lurch to the right. And I was talking to my sons the other day, and I was saying that the two things which I think have led to this point, we've had about 250 years of colonial supremacy, about 250 years. And what's leading to their decline eventually are, in my view, two things. One, racial supremacy. Okay. Any type of supremacy is by definition wrong and damaging. Even religious supremacy. If I say I'm a Muslim, therefore I'm superior, I'm actually committing the same issues, right? And we've seen the consequences of that. We've actually seen the consequences of that in our own Muslim world, where some people have claimed more Muslimness and then they've persecuted other minority sects in Islam. So any form of supremacy. Now we've had racial supremacy, white racial supremacy, first and foremost. And the second thing, and they've institutionalized it. We know that racial supremacy has been institutionalized in Western countries in various ways. And the other thing, I think, is the inability to handle capitalism, where capitalism, because capitalism doesn't have to be bad, you can create more compassionate forms of capitalism, but where they have allowed wealth inequality to reach horrible proportions. And so the vast majority of people in Western economies, even though they're wealthy economies, the people work on slave wages. And because they work on slave wages, they are very unhappy. And when there's economic decline, we know that society is lurched to the right. My view, my reading of this is that these are the two things. And then I see the Quran. And I see the Quran where there are foundational verses about the beauty of creation and diversity of creation. So I think to myself, well, people are talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion and justice, the Jedi framework. But the Quran's already got it. The Quran's already said that Allah has created you in various tribes and communities. He has given you your own law and an open way. We are to celebrate the diversity in creation. So as a Muslim, I can very comfortably situate myself in an EDI space. I can very comfortably situate myself in the human rights space. When the Quran talks about charity, it does not talk about charity to other Muslims. It talks about charity to people who are vulnerable in society. So a disabled person, a widow, an orphan, it doesn't say a Muslim widow. It doesn't say a Muslim orphan. So the Quran's charity is universal. And you've got all of this depth of meaning in that book, even in terms of the climate crisis, the fact that we have been sent here as custodians. The Quran tells us we are custodians of this planet, therefore we're meant to look after it. You could create your whole theology and protections for climate just based on the Quranic verses. You could create economic models which can create compassionate capitalism. I personally think that what Muslims need is for our future generations, particularly, and I think that young Muslims are actually very promising. I certainly feel that, but I am an eternal optimist. But I do feel that they're very promising. And I think that what we need is, we need leadership. And we need leadership which is grounded in the Quranic ethic. I also think that we need to shift our focus away from religiosity and the debates on hijab and nail polish and women's makeup and their clothing and their voices. This is trivialization of Islam. You trivialize it to a level where your entire community of 2 billion people are writing essays and theses about women's clothing. Third, send your most gifted children to study the Islamic sciences. Don't just send them to become doctors and engineers and accountants. Send your best minds to this, to the humanities, to history. I do feel that Muslims need a proper education in history. That is one of the major issues, because anyone who comes up with contextualist approaches to the Quran, and we know that contextualism makes the Quran dynamic, it makes it come alive. The moment you do that, orthodoxy comes in and says, but here's the literal meaning of this word. This meaning has remained steady for 1400 years. How dare you look at another meaning? And you say, well, meanings are formed in context. And here's the historical context. So why is Allah saying to Muslim women, cover your chest? Why is he saying in Surah Nur, cover your chest, cover your juyub? Because women did not cover the juyub. That is the historical context. How do you understand this verse? It's not talking in a vacuum. And so what we need are those education systems. And I absolutely agree. I think knowledge is power. And one of the things I try to do is, academia can be very exclusive. That's one of the things I don't like about it. And I say that as an academic myself, because academics have big egos often, and they want to sound clever. And because they want to sound very clever, they use these big terms and these big words and these complex concepts, and they're very alienating. And there are very few people who are public intellectuals. So you look at people like Noam Chomsky, for example, or Professor Jeffrey Sachs and others, public intellectuals, and they're great people, and they make knowledge accessible. Really complex knowledge, and make it accessible. And so one of the things that I try to do in my very humble capacity is to unpack those processes of knowledge creation, because I'm not interested in giving halal, haram, yes, no fatwas to people. That's not my role. I'm not a mufti. I'm not a sheikh. My role, I believe, is to make it easier for people to understand how knowledge and interpretation is arrived at, because I feel that that is where empowerment is. And I personally feel that Muslim women are so dynamic, Grace. I don't know if that's been your experience, but when I've talked to Muslim women, and so many women get in touch in response to my videos, on Facebook as well. Inshallah, I'll set up a new website soon, so it's easier for people to get in touch with me. But my God, Muslim women are dynamic, they are forward thinking, and they really care, and they don't want children to be poor or hungry or to be dying. And Muslim women, because of the oppression that we have faced, I feel that we really have the power to turn that oppression into an empowerment. So we do read the Quran in liberatory ways. So you're absolutely right, we are oppressed, we are right at the bottom of civilization, but the only way now is up. So in crisis, I think in crisis sometimes, if we try not to hold on to our trauma and our regressiveness, I think that we can unleash all of that pain and turn it into something really positive, this positive energy and impetus. And I personally feel that women are going to be at the forefront of it. And the reason for that is quite simply that women, by and large, the transfer of Islamic knowledge and the Islamic way of life is done by women. It's mothers who do this. Yes, fathers get involved sometimes, and fathers can be peripherally involved sometimes. But when I look around me in my social circle, who's teaching children how to pray? Mum. Who's teaching them the Shahada? Mum. Who's teaching hygiene to children? Mum. Who's teaching them to eat with the right hand, to say their Bismillah before they start eating? Mum's doing that. So mothers have this immense power and influence, but also they are the holders of knowledge. And what I feel is really sad is that in this politics of hijab, which is so divisive and corrupting, it divides us. We don't form a sisterhood, because a woman who's a hijabi is judging me and not feeling my pain, and I might be a non-hijabi judging her, not feeling her pain. It divides us. But if we were to come together, we will find that we have huge amounts of power and influence. So we can immediately start influencing the next generation. I personally feel that the more educated, critical thinkers there are amongst Muslim women, the quicker the change will be. That's my sense, because they are so influential. Because they'll be sat at the dinner table saying to their children, the Quran is not patriarchal. And I know because I've read this. That is where the power is. So that's my sense. So I know things are very difficult for Muslims, but I also feel that I think the Salafism and Wahhabism did hit a peak, but I think that it is now in decline. That's my sense. I think there are pockets where there is a reassertive patriarchy, and I think there are pockets, but it's where there is this austerity. But because it's so ugly, I think there is a natural revulsion to it. And I think people are now, especially women, are now more open to saying, I don't feel good about any of this. I cannot love a God who is biased against me. I want to find out more. And I think that is where the change would come from. I genuinely do. But if we keep trivializing, and I think Muslim women have to take note, because if you're always caught up in debates about, a strand of hair showing, or am I wearing lipstick right, or what are my nails like, you're not going to be able to think bigger. And if you want to think bigger and bring change, then you've got to step away from this trivialized version of Islam, and look towards its ethical core, which is so powerful. And it does have answers to all of these serious social crises and economic crises, and even political crises that we're seeing around us. I genuinely believe that, Grace.
I 100% agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that I just wanted to add, not everyone can be a scholar, or scholar adjacent, right? I mean, I one of the things that I actually love about the message of Islam is that it can be so resonant for someone who is illiterate to someone who's an absolute genius and polymath, and and obviously everyone in between. And one of the things, like one of the very influential books for me that I think people have found is Search for Beauty by Professor Abou El Fadl. And it's based on real life stories here in America, people who came to him, as a sheikh, asking for advice about every matter under the sun. But it's all premised on this idea that God is beautiful and God loves beauty, and that the most important heuristic or measure for what is truly authentic in Islam, we've already been given, is that sense of what is beautiful and what is ugly. And if anything is ugly, like morally ugly, by definition, we already know what that feels like. No one has to describe to us what is beautiful and what is ugly. So you have your own internal gauge. And so beauty, is virtue, it's freedom, it's empowerment, it's creativity. It's, everything that you can imagine that a human being would thrive in, right? We were talking about human thriving. And so, like, and then that book is also an engagement with our intellectual tradition, because he has conversations with jurists from, all different locations from our 1400-year history, and all of them come together at night. This is a beautiful sort of like, analogy. He comes and he has these discussions with jurists of all different outlooks. But the point of it is, what is the most beautiful way to solve whatever problem is at hand? Because that's how we come closer to the divine. That's how we become closer to God. And so it's this constant search for beauty. And I think that is, even for those people who are not able to, engage like epistemology or knowledge creation, I mean, that is such an important role to play, because the Muslim women I've encountered are brilliant also, and they're searching, and they have so much capacity to do so much good. They just need to be unleashed, right? They need to be unleashed from the mental shackles that have been placed upon them by patriarchal men and patriarchal interpretations of our tradition. But, you don't have to be a scholar to understand, to have access to that internal heuristic of what's beautiful. And that should lead you to reject anything that doesn't sit well with you. And like, one of the things that was so liberating for me very early in my journey is just to understand that there is a plethora of opinion, right? Like this whole idea of, like, I didn't know what Islamic law was. I didn't know what Sharia was. But the idea that you have, all of these learned people trying to answer the question, what does God want from us? And extremely learned, not just like internet, scholars, self-appointed scholars, but people who really study the tradition and really think carefully and seriously about God's word and what does that mean for us. But we have the capacity to do that as well, because even though the jurists offer these opinions, they're opinions, they're for us to engage with our own mind and our heart and our intuition and conscience to decide, okay, is this what sits right with me in my relationship with God? And that direct relationship to God is really the lifeline for everything. And so whenever I'm writing or I'm talking, like, I always encourage, like, the most important thing is building that very intimate, beautiful, loving relationship with God that's just unique to you and God. And it's as simple as starting by just having conversations with God. There are many people who I'm surprised don't speak to God, don't think about God, don't engage, with God. And yet God is right there waiting for you to invite God into your life. And that is, talk about game changer, right? You want God to be your partner in everything. So even if I always joke, like, I'm driving, I'm looking for a parking space. Please, God, help me find a parking space. And without fail, I always get the greatest parking space. And it's happened so much, it's not even a coincidence anymore. But it's just something as simple as, like, the most menial tasks in your day, to be thinking that, okay, God is right there with me. And, like, it's such a source of empowerment and comfort. But it's the key to everything. And knowing that God is watching everything, God sees everything, God knows everything. You don't even have to explain, because God already knows. And wow, right? That is so comforting. You're not alone. But for people to embrace that in our faith and lean on it in light of so much ugliness around us, and to be able to have the bravery to say, okay, this doesn't sit right with me. I may not know the answer, but it's out there somewhere. So at a minimum, I'm going to set it aside, because I really hate this this thrashing of our people with Islamic law, like this like weaponization of Islamic law that lands because people are not educated in Islamic law, nor should they be. Like, there's this underlying like assumption that everyone has to be an expert in Islamic law in order to navigate life as a Muslim, and that's simply not true. But it's very effective, right? Like, even in my own experience, when someone is coming at me at my comments and throwing Arabic jurisprudential terms at me, but I understand what they're saying and enough to say, no, you're wrong, and let me throw some back at you, like, that's not okay. Like, I was on, as another example, on Facebook on this page called Blogging Theology. And a woman posted something about how the hijab is obligatory. And so then, of course, I come in and I say no. And people are like, no, this is ijma. And so I'm challenging people. And I'm like, what do you mean by ijma? Because ijma itself is a very, very political concept, right? It's like consensus. There's a whole argument about consensus of who? The general population, learned people of their time. It's like to just say that there's a consensus betrays how little you know about consensus, but it gets sent into the, social media sphere as truth, and no one has any ability to challenge it. So, but then it effectively then just silences you, because it's like, okay, well, I'm not an Islamic scholar. So, I know enough to kind of know stuff, but I can't, if every challenge to your objection is, well, here's what Islamic law has to say, that's a silencing tool.
It is, yeah. And the thing is, Islamic law, people talk about Islamic law. I've been doing a lot of research because I've been working on a paper, Grace. There's a conference in Cambridge in June by the British Association of Islamic Studies. So they hold an annual conference. And I had put a proposal in for a paper. And in that paper, I want to look at the relationship between law and justice. And the reason why I want to look into that is what is just actually changes. Justice is a dynamic concept. Okay, what is just actually changes. So, for example, during Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time, because women needed physical protection from, they physically needed protection from men. So women could only survive if they were under male protection. They couldn't survive otherwise. And women were very accepting of institutions like polygamy. And so you could look at a verse of the Quran which makes some allowance for polygamy. I'm not saying that this is what the Quran wants at all times, but we know that some allowance for polygamy is made. How women in that society will accept it and what their level of acceptance and tolerance for that would be very different from now, where we now think of marriage as a monogamous institution, predominantly a monogamous institution. And predominantly, this is how societies think. So women will have a very different threshold around that. And so many women will cry out with pain and say, this is unjust. It feels wrong to me. Why does the Quran want me to become the second wife or the third wife, or the isolated and unhappy first wife of a man who's now married somebody younger? They really feel that pain and they think of it as injustice. And what we're trying to do is when we hold these debates about Islamic law, again, we detach them from the context, the social context in which those laws emerged. And laws change when societies change. There's a lot of really complex literature on the interplay between social change and legal change. And lots of debates about whether social change happens first and then legal change happens, or whether legal change can lead to social change and all of that. I'm not going to bore the audience with that. But I've been thinking about that quite a lot because I want to make sense of the principles of justice which are being maintained by the shape and form of the law we encounter in the Quran. So, for example, there are punishments in the Quran, what we call, in the hudud laws, the had, the punishment, the limit of a punishment where a serious crime is committed. And the Quran prescribes quite harsh punishments, right? Now, in our modern sensibilities, we can't quite stomach those forms of punishment, right? What does that mean? Does that mean that the form of punishment is also eternally valid? Or is it the fact that it is the underlying crime and the moral transgression that's been done that's eternally valid? So those are the kind of questions I want to tease out in that paper. And I suppose what I want to say is, in response to the comment you made, is that we end up reducing the Quran to a book of laws. Now, law is a very specialist field. You're right. If people want to do law and they want to scholarship on that, they can do it. I love Islamic jurisprudence because I find it a fascinating space. I don't consider myself an expert. I'm an early career researcher, right? 20 years down the road, I might be saying something different. when my thoughts matured even more. But the legal verses in the Quran make up about 5 to 7% of the Quran. The rest of the Quran are stories with moral points and moral kind of a moral thrust to them. The rest of the Quran is ethics. It's about tazkiyah and purification of your soul so you become a better person. So I would say that predominantly the Quran is a book of morality and ethics. It gives us a wonderful moral framework which can be justified on rational grounds. Unlike liberalism, which is full of moral contradictions, the Quranic moral framework can be justified on rational grounds. Now, some people want to go into philosophy and do that, and some people might just be lay readers. Open up the Quran and just read it. I say this to people when I was teaching my friends' daughters as well. On a Friday evening, I would go to their house, and for about an hour or so, we would talk about the Quran and go through some verses. And of course, most of the session was about, and this happened at school today, Sitara auntie, and that happened at school today, and somebody was racist, which was amazing because I could then continue to ground them into the Quran and say, well, this is what the Quran would say. This is how you deal with the situation. 10-year-olds understand the moral message of the Quran. 8-year-olds understand, 15-year-olds understand. Why do 40-year-old people not understand the moral message of the Quran? Because by then you've become indoctrinated. By then you've taken up dogma. By then you've taken up a sectarian approach or a fundamentalist approach or whatever. So what we need to do is we need to stop reducing the Quran to a set of laws and understand that we would have to take the moral principles and values from the Quran and look at a new set of laws. For example, when it comes to marriage, we haven't updated our contracts of marriage in hundreds of years. They are not fit for purpose. Our contracts of marriage need to be updated and they need to be detached from the earlier fiqh, and you need to create something new. That's for experts to do. But at a moral level, does an individual, as you were saying, kind of that inner sense of that authentic sense of right and wrong, which should be intact in most people, why would somebody want to stomach the idea of domestic violence in marriage? Leave everything aside. Let's say I'm not interested in jurisprudence. I'm just an ordinary person. Do I, as an ordinary person, like the idea of domestic violence? And from then onwards, how can I allow somebody or sit and listen to an interpretation where somebody's using the beautiful message and the beautiful message of the Quran and God's moral guidance to sanction something as horrible and ugly as domestic violence? That level of analysis is available to all human beings who have fundamentally a basic sense of right and wrong. Because Allah has given us a fitrah, He's told us this. He's given us an inherent sense of right and wrong. There's a rational kind of sense of right and wrong. And that's why I can sit with somebody who's an atheist, and I would agree with them that domestic violence is wrong, cheating is wrong, lying is wrong, and not paying your taxes is wrong. I would agree with them. And they wouldn't have read the Quran, and I would have read the Quran. And it's this level of analysis, and I think that's what makes me sad, is that this level of analysis is not being done by Muslims because they're so indoctrinated and their understanding of Islam is so dogmatic and second-hand always. I'll listen to this scholar and that scholar, and if he's a wife beater, he's coming to and telling you, I control my women, and I don't control one woman, I control 4 women. And you take that as Islam. What has happened to your basic sense of decency? So I think what Muslims need to do is to think about the Quran as a book of moral guidance and work on that basic sense of decency and universal moral values and draw some lines. And when it comes to women, those lines need to be drawn really strongly. No Muslim man who calls himself a Muslim should ever be writing on social media or coming on YouTube and giving a sermon about how it's okay for a husband to discipline his wife. Because if you are even if you're a decent Muslim, and even if you've done the bare minimum of reading, and if you're a decent human being, you will not be saying that. So the fact that we have used a legalistic view of the Quran and then used it to corrupt the very moral teachings of the Quran is sad. It's appalling that that's happened. And we need to fight back to that. And we need to listen to our inner selves, as you're saying, Grace. I mean, what you said will be dismissed by traditionalists, because the traditionalists would say they take a linguistic approach. This is the nas, this is the text of the Quran. The text of the Quran has said this, therefore. But what we're saying is that the text of the Quran talks to the reader. It's not in a vacuum. What is the reader reading into the text of the Quran? And why is he reading domestic violence into the text of the Quran? Because he's already violent. He's already violent. And so it's this process that I think Muslims have stopped doing. And they don't read the Quran. I mean, I have read the Quran with children. I read it with my own children, and I tended to focus more on the translation of the Quran because Arabic is an alien language to them, alien in the sense that they can't comprehend it. And I have seen children gravitate to the Quran like ducks to water. And they get it, they get the basics. When you say to a 10-year-old, somebody's been racist to you, but you're not allowed to be racist to them. Because the Quran says in Surah Al-Baqarah, always speak a good word to people. And I've had my students come back to me and say, Sitara auntie, that is such a high standard that Allah has set. Yes, this is the high ethical standard he has set. Somebody's racist to you, don't be racist to them. You can't be racist to them because then you'd be committing the same hurtful sin. And so why are we not doing that basic? And I think this is where mothers can play a role. I mean, honestly, I always say to women, just what has happened, I think, is we've been told that we can't understand the Quran ourselves and we need to have 15 years of tuition from Sheikh so-and-so before we can read. No, the basics, the moral basics, the Quran yields them if you're open-minded and if you want to take those moral basics in. And this is why, the illiterate Bedouins in Prophet Muhammad's time were reading the Quran and understanding the basics. And there were other people who became scholars of the Quran and they became more specialized in their knowledge and people would seek their opinion. Those processes will always happen. But I think the Muslim community should make it incumbent upon themselves as an individual to read the Quran as a book of moral guidance, first and foremost. Leave the law to one side to begin with. In terms of rules and regulations, whatever we need in our lives to be Muslim, we've been taught through the Sunnah. We've been taught how to pray, we've been taught how to fast, and we've been taught how to give zakat. We've been taught how to do Hajj and Umrah if we can afford it, right? In an essence, we've been taught how to eat. We've been taught to eat halal food, and we've been taught to dress modestly. This is the core of Islam. You can be, I mean, in Pakistan, if I go to a village setting where the vast majority of population has had no formal schooling whatsoever, most people, by the way, in Pakistan, so many children, millions of them leave school at the age of 8. But they go to the mosque and they know how to pray. So there is Islam. So I think as a community, we need to feel confident that we have enough knowledge transfer happening already. We have the Sunnah being transferred from one generation to the next, so we know how to live as Muslims. And then we have the beautiful preserved revelation from God. And what we need to do is reconnect to that at a very basic level and stop judging ourselves. I can't understand the Quran, it's too complex. No, just pick up 2 or 3 different translations, be open-minded, read them, see what you gravitate towards, and keep reading it throughout your life. It will change you. But people don't do that. And women particularly don't do that because they have been told, you're stupid. I mean, for how many centuries have we been told that we're stupid? And that was one of the reasons, when I started to kind of delve into this more, I used to think, but I know that I'm not stupid. I'm sat in a classroom full of people and I'm doing advanced mathematics and I know that I'm not stupid. So, where does this come from? So I think women need to just step away from this dogma and have the courage to dismiss it. And, I'm going to sit here and give women, if they're feeling, oh my God, what is she saying? And, she's just being too bold about it. I'm going to give women permission and reject the hadith that says women are intellectually inferior, because that hadith is not sound. So please stop receiving these as truths and believe in your inner self and say, yes, Allah has created me smart and He's created me compassionate and I'm a nurturer. That's who I am as a woman. That's my power. And I'm going to dip into that power and do that. And I think hopefully then that would emancipate women from the shackles, as you say, that are stopping us from reaching for the stars.
And that's so beautiful. I think that's a lovely place to end, because now we've gone over 2 hours. Of course, it didn't feel like that.
No.
And the only thing I would add is, like I learned from Dr. Abou El Fadl, that when you talk about law, law is the outer boundary. It's not something that gives you morality, and that does come from the Quran. Number one. And number two, like when one of the things that was really striking to me when I first met Dr. Abou El Fadl, after having, sort of engaged with the Muslim community for almost a year, what was so moving for me and so in a sense tragic is needing the permission to think, needing permission to question, needing permission to believe in, what's within you, as what God gave you. It's exactly what you said, like you should take that license, own it. It's you and God, and God put you here for a reason, for a purpose. You have a specific, gift. Everyone, I believe, has a gift. And part of our duty is to figure out what that is and how do we use it to serve the greater good on behalf of God. But the fact that people feel they need permission to do something that God has already given them permission to do is just simply wrong. This is not something that we should be proud of within our communities. And part of fighting back and pushing back and standing for justice and mercy is to own those beautiful qualities within ourselves and to feel unleashed to do a lot of good. And I hope that, inshallah, the work that you do, the very, very important work that you do, Sitara, and also, hopefully whatever little contribution I can make with my, crazy little videos that make people go crazy can just push people to think outside of the box, right? And to find their way, and hopefully, embrace the beauty that we have been given, because truly, I mean, what's in the Quran is such a gift. If only people knew, if only they took the time to engage. I hope that people would take the time to engage the tafsir, because that entire journey we did for 3 years is all free and online on our YouTube channel at the Usuli Institute, and it's truly game changing. It's all there, it's there for the taking if you want it. And I think you owe it to yourself. You owe it to the purpose that God created you, to do everything in your power to liberate yourself and empower yourself. And thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I hope we can have many more in the future. Because I had a whole list of things I wanted to ask you about. We didn't even get to that, but it doesn't even matter. Like I think this
Maybe
was
next time.
Inshallah. And I look forward to the comments if people want to add comments to see what the reaction is. But, at a minimum, we were talking about how the good thing about the comments is it creates a space for discourse, right? This is a very controversial topic, but there's nowhere really to discuss it. And even if it just starts there, that's a good start, because we should be in conversation, and we should not be afraid to challenge and disagree and engage. So, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Grace. Yeah.
If you have closing thoughts or anything you'd like to share.
I think the work that you're doing, Grace, and a lot of Muslim women are now doing, finding their voice, is so important, because by doing that, we're opening up space, as you've said, for fresh thinking, new thinking to come out, for people to benefit from that. And we would hope that through this work, in that drip feed that we're doing, that it will at some point become a lovely stream and grow its own habitat, and that we would be able to attract other Muslim men and Muslim women who think like us, who really genuinely care about their religion, and who see the Quran as holding promise for them. And I think that's all we're trying to do. And I'm certainly trying to encourage people to think, and as you're doing as well, to think bigger and to step away from all of these really trivial issues. And I know the hijab is not trivial for women, but the way it's been approached it's trivialized our religion into an item of clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by stepping away from that and zooming out a little bit and seeing the big picture, I think we can all see how we can, in our own humble capacity, make a contribution, whether that's at home, how we raise our children, or whether it's here through conversation and scholarship that we've done today.
Absolutely. And I really want to encourage people to watch Dr. Sitara's, wonderful halakas on the hijab, because you get, an immersion in, and don't be scared. It's like, this is a really accessible very thoughtful, very insightful way to see how knowledge production works and the impact of it. Because to me, it's just so clear. You watch it, and it's like, okay, this one answers the question that hijab, hijab is nuanced, as is every other topic that, and it deserves its due. And we need to honor this type of education, and it leads to so much more, like freedom of thought, liberation in spirit. So just to start there is extremely empowering and important. So thank you for that work, and sharing that journey, because it took a lot for you to pull it all together, and you do it so seamlessly. It's like it's very easy to follow and clarifying. So thank you for that.
Thanks
And
very much, Grace. And for referencing it in your video, because quite a few people have been in touch with me after that. And again, that's kind of restarted the conversation on the hijab. I think Muslim women feel very strongly about the hijab, rightly so. I respect their right to wear the hijab. But equally, I would like Muslim women to also create space for other Muslim women who don't wear the hijab. So we can all form a sisterhood and we can all work together to, well, to create a better world.
yes, absolutely. And I want women to make that choice
Mhm.
on study due diligence, not just on inherited wisdom, inherited assumptions, right?
Yeah,
Because that can lead to that idea of supremacy and silencing other women. So
yeah, yeah.
yeah, thank you
Oh,
so much. We could go
wonderful.
on for hours.
No, thanks so much, Grace, for inviting me. As I said, it's been so wonderful having this conversation. It's been a very in-depth conversation as well. We've covered so many things. So I really hope that the audience benefit from it and it provides some food for thought. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to people's comments as well. And I'll try to respond where I can. Thank you
Inshallah.
so
Thank you
much.
so much, everybody, and wishing you all the best. And inshallah, we will gather again soon.
Yeah.
So, assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, so I hit end recording. And did you get a message just to say to wait for it to finish uploading or something like that? Well, let me see. Oh, whoops. Actually, no, it didn't.